YouTube? Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video, Mr. Terry. Today we are heading into the middle of the six-part 1918 flu pandemic series by Extra History. We've done a great job so far of building up the kind of the early, I guess, appearance of the big 1918 flu pandemic that killed anywhere probably from 50 to 100 million people between about 1918 and 1920. And like I've said repeatedly in the first two videos, I think it's really important that we're studying this right now at this time with a current pandemic going on to try to get some context and a little bit of precedent to things that may look like this or something like that, just so we can learn and just be educated on the matter, right? So where they kind of ended up in episode 2 was they talked about how a lot of this is coming from the American perspective. It does seem there, but soldiers were getting it in training camps. Were coming up with this and then being sent overseas to the trenches where then it was being spread. And then by the end of the war had spread to the German side. And they talked about in episode 2 how they may have really hurt potentially their Germany's big offensive that they did in after the Americans had joined. They did a big offensive, especially after the war in the East was over, when the newly created Soviet Union, or just, regime change, I should say, led to a peace treaty pulling Russia out of the war, thus being able to let Germany shift troops out to the West. And that ends up being a failure because the Allies were able to not only counter it, but make their own offensive, pushing to the German border. And the war basically ends. They really talk about the actual end of the war. I mean, not that that's the point of this, to look at that. But just basically, though, they were saying the German offensive was definitely weakened by having so many soldiers. I want to say 500,000, 500,000 or something like that, ended up contracting it, and possibly making an effect on their push there. And I guess by that extent, the end of their war. So anyway, let's go ahead and jump in. So it looks like they are now getting to, well, the first scene 1 second in here is 1 month later. So maybe that means 1 month after the war ends. And what they alluded to, or what they kind of also referenced at the end of the first video, was that the deadliest phase actually of the pandemic happened after the war. When things started turning to normalcy, and then it hit kind of in a big second wave. And that's something I'm really interested in to see what that looked like. Is once things look like they're calming down, why maybe do they come back, right? So we're going to check this out. All right, original video is down below. Make sure you click the original video link so you can go over there, give a like and subscribe, view all those sorts of things to the awesome crew over at Extra History. And then if you haven't subbed to my channel, love to have you around too. Okay, and let's go ahead and get started then. So we got 1 month later. Now we're still referencing the war, so we got to keep prepared for war. Helmets on, everybody, and let's do this.
Month later. Brakes squeal, steam vents. Dr. Welch and his team are pulling into a train station in Washington, D.C., returning from a grueling cross-country inspection of military hospitals. They hope to make their report and get some rest. Instead, a soldier meets them on the platform with new orders. Proceed immediately to Devin's. Spanish influenza has struck the camp.
So you can imagine now that the war had spread throughout the entire trench system on both sides, all these soldiers that were fortunate enough to survive and actually get to go home are bringing it back to their home countries. So you could see how this is going to just probably make it explode back in these home nations.
8 hours later, Welch and his team arrive in Massachusetts. They find Camp Devin's paralyzed. Patients fill each inch of hospital space, turning blue and coughing so hard they tear their abdominal muscles. They hemorrhage blood from their noses and scream in fevered delirium. In extreme cases, the disease has ripped tiny holes in their lungs. Oxygen leaks out, collecting beneath the victim's skin, so they crackle when nurses roll them over, like the pop-snap sound of rice cereal.
Wow, I had no idea it did like that. I'd heard they had said extensively in the first 2 episodes that one of the ways you die is you end up suffocating, basically, because your lungs will fill up with a fluid and you can't breathe. And it's like it affects your respiratory system. And I mean, I guess that's still happening here, but wow, this is way more, I don't know, painful, I guess, in a way, and so unique to how it affects your bodies than I ever thought.
What is happening? All training has stopped. Recruits that aren't sick have been put into service caring for those that are. Nearly half the camp's medical staff is ill. Some didn't even show symptoms, they just collapsed. These sudden onset patients often die within 12 hours. Those that avoid that quick death are falling to secondary pneumonia infections. The Army has arranged special trains to take away the dead, and it's already showing up in Boston. After a marathon session of autopsies revealing lungs full of frothy blood, the team turns to Welch. He's the head of the American Medical Association and has studied rare diseases on 3 continents. Shaken, Welch says, "This must be some kind of new infection or plague." Then he runs out of the room, stepping around sick men to get to a phone. He calls his boss, Army Surgeon General Gorgas. "This is going to spread," he says. "The Army needs to shut down troop movements and expand hospital space now."
Okay, so the war's not over. When they said 1 month later, I wasn't exactly sure what they were referring to. It was 1 month after the war ended or something like that. But, or I don't know. I still don't know exactly what timeline they're doing. Because, yeah, it's going to spread because I can see how quickly it is spreading. And the way, especially when you get things, I think, when it comes to diseases that affect your lungs, that means when you breathe, it can spread it a lot further if it can be done that way. But they also said in the other video, maybe that's what they're talking about here. Any more clarification on the timeline of what they're starting with here was that it's often the case with these ailments that the viruses they mutate, right? They evolve into stronger strains because they reproduce so quickly. Anytime something reproduces, it never makes perfect copies, so the copies can have different elements to them and possibly be more resistant. And those most resistant ones, they are going to be able to spread faster because they don't get defeated. And maybe that's what they're talking about here. Any more clarification, though?
Then he calls the Rockefeller Institute and orders Dr. Oswald Avery to report to Devins. Avery is a peculiar man. Like Welch, he'd shown no interest in marriage or family, but unlike Welch, who schmoozed at private clubs and vacationed in Atlantic City, Avery had no hobbies or social life.
You know that stereotype of the party animal womanizing scientist, right?
He is a single-minded obsessive who lives in an apartment next to the Institute and talks only about his work. If anybody could find the pathogen responsible, Avery could. But they have so little time. Several things need to happen, Welch reasons. They need to figure out how the disease spreads and how to kill it, and whether they could do anything to stop it. They need to identify the pathogen, the bacteria or toxin that caused this disease, so they could develop a serum, antitoxin, or vaccine. And that was Avery's task. Avery, who had done such good work on the pneumonia serum they'd tested in the summer, which might come in handy given all the secondary pneumonia cases. But Welch and his team weren't the only ones hunting for the pathogen. Long Island, New York. The speeding...
Okay, so you got multiple people researching it. That's always a good thing, right? If you have multiple people researching treatments.
Board of Health car fishtails down the dirt road.
Let's all appreciate the awesome Model T, which was going to be such a big deal with automobiles as the first affordable yet dependable-ish compared to modern standards automobile for the common man.
Inside it sits the most unusual pair in American medicine. In the passenger seat, hanging on for dear life, is Dr. William Park. Behind the wheel, with her foot firmly on the accelerator, is the lab's assistant director.
From an accelerator going 20 miles an hour.
Dr. Anna Williams. The two seem almost polar opposites. Where Park is religious, Williams doubts. He's a gentleman born to high society, where she prefers driving fast cars and riding shotgun on stunt planes.
She seems awesome. I like her already.
But in 25 years of collaboration, they've won fame for their work on polio, rabies, and diphtheria.
Nice.
Which is why they're speeding towards an army base. If American doctors hope to produce a vaccine or serum to fight this new disease, they need Park and Williams. No one, not even their rivals at Rockefeller, can produce vaccine in the quantities Park can. If they isolate the pathogen, he can inject it into a horse, then draw the blood and extract the equine antibodies. And Park has a lot of horses. It's how they made enough diphtheria antitoxin to supply every doctor in New York free of charge.
Nice.
They park the car, tie on their masks, and get to work. Within hours, they're heading back to the city. the backseat stuffed full of throat swabs, blood samples, and lung tissue. Both teams are looking for the same thing, Bacillus influenzae. 16 years earlier, the German physician Richard Pfeiffer had identified it as the cause of influenza.
That's amazing. I haven't heard about him as much, but that's quite a breakthrough to be able to identify that. Remember, this era is also fairly early on in getting effective microscopes are now, that opened up a completely new world, of course, where the medical field has that. It can start looking at bacterias and, again, things you can't see with the common eye, and how that just completely opened up the world of biology and medicine.
Discovery so momentous that the microbe was nicknamed Pfeiffersbacillus. But Pfeiffer's is difficult to identify and isolate. A tiny error in preparation can ruin the sample.
Do you want to be named? Do you want your name attached to some deadly thing? That's scary. Like hurricanes, how they name them after. Yeah, they give them people names. Not specific ones, though.
So finding it takes time. Meanwhile, Army epidemiologists are tracking the spread of the disease. They could actually chart it on a map, jumping from base to base along shipping routes and rail lines. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, New Orleans, Puget Sound, the Great Lakes. Sometimes men became
ports.
so sick in transit that they had to be carried off the ships and trains when they reached their destinations. Their initial investigation suggests it's severe influenza. That means it's airborne and can survive for hours on hard surfaces.
That is your deadly combination. Once a illness or some kind, disease, whatever you want to call it, goes airborne, that is tough. And if it can actually survive through the air, I think, which is hard to do. I'm not a biologist. Let's get a biology teacher here. And then survive on hard surfaces that long, that's got to mean it is a very, very resilient and strong strain to be able to survive like that. I know, just as reference, going back to the Black Death, that once it went airborne with the pneumonic plague, it was far more deadly and had like a 100% nearly death rate if you got that when it became airborne. That's like the red alarm. I mean, they already have that, but that's bad as it gets.
The large number of secondary infections indicate that it suppresses the immune system. Surgeon General Gorgas tries to raise the alarm. He insists his superiors freeze all transfers and stop the troop ships. At the very least, they could hold the men in quarantine for a week before they board.
Makes sense.
The military refuses. Germany is on their last legs, they argue. The Austrians and the Ottomans are rumored to be drafting peace offers. This is not the time to let up the pressure.
That's hard because you get the perspectives of, okay, so we are at the end of the war. The war's not over yet. So that's good. I finally clarified this far into it. But yeah, I could see the predicament, of course, that the military is in, because if they can't end this thing quickly, then they just lost their entire advantage and potentially their ability to end the war. But at the same time, this thing's going to spread and cause even more death. So it's like a lose-lose situation, really. I don't know how else you can describe it.
Nothing must distract them or the public from the war effort. They send out the next draft registration, forcing thousands of men across the country to crowd into civic buildings to fill out paperwork.
There we go. It's going to break it even more.
Protests. What is the point of this? The camps have stopped all training to deal with the outbreak.
True.
These new draftees wouldn't become fighting men. They'd just report for duty and get flu.
Ooh. Well, they wouldn't have somewhere to report. Well, they report to the registration center, so they're not practicing any kind of social distancing or something like that. They're getting all together. They're going to spread it. And it would be worse if they have in fact closed the training camps. What would they do for training? Are they just going to send them right to the front lines, which would be leading them into disaster potentially, because you'd have virtually no fighting experience, because these are drafted soldiers. They aren't people that are already trained. They're going to go into death in another way, because you're going to be going up fighting against or fighting in a war that's already been taking place for multiple years, and people that are trained and know how to do things. So again, lose-lose situation, right? Send them in. I mean, get them trained. They're going to go bring the disease and die anyways, or hold them back. And then the war effort is really poor, because potentially the other side, the Central Power side, could maybe regroup,
Finally, a win. The Army
Oh?
agrees and cancels the next draft. But it's too late. As Gorgas battles the generals, unit commanders are already ignoring medical advice. At Camp Grant, a doctor sits in the commandant's office telling his commander that the overcrowding situation is dangerous. He's ignoring regulations. Too many men in the barracks and on transfer trains. The commandant's answer will seal his fate. In 2 weeks,
Yeah.
the doctor will be back in this office, telling him that 500 men are dead. The last troop train they'd sent had turned into a plague train. A quarter of the transfers had to be hospitalized, and the camp had run out of coffins. Upon hearing this, the commandant will order the doctor out of his office, draw his pistol, and take his own life. But that is 2 weeks from now. At this moment, he says the
2 weeks from now. Okay. Wow, he felt so bad that he could deal with that grief. That's incredible. Jeez.
overcrowding is necessary. This is war, doctor. But as bad as things are in the military, they're worse on the civilian front. The head of the Public Health Service is in denial. He issues a useless notice on how to avoid influenza and collects some statistics, but does nothing more. The military worries that raising public awareness of the flu will damage morale, and he's not a man to stand up to the military, and he's not alone. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, people are starting to collapse on the street or fall from horseback.
Okay. So it's hit the public now. It's not just a military thing because troops go back and forth too from the war. They go and then they'll come back, and there's interaction. It's not just one-way travel. Things are going back and forth. So, I mean, they said how basically it looked like most of the major port cities I could think of that they showed, they all got these big outbreaks, and then now regular people are just collapsing. This is awful. So it's hit that. Once it hits the common, vein of society, it's hard to stop without major quarantines and enforcement happening there. It has to, right?
Packing, shivering patients fill hospitals. Employee absenteeism hikes up, but civic leaders refuse to admit the growing crisis. As Park and Williams race to identify the pathogen, with half their staff ill and some dying, the head of the New York Board of Health, a homeopath with no scientific training, denies there's an epidemic.
Wait, this guy's the head of New York Health and has no training? How do you get that
With half their
job?
staff ill and some dying, the head of the New York Board of Health, a homeopath with no scientific training,
Why does he have this job? Head of the Board of Health for the most densely populated city in America has this and is making policy on medicine or on a disease and stuff.
denies there's an epidemic. In Philadelphia, the mayor and his health officials are telling the press that the outbreak is nearly over. They continue doing so day after day as the death toll mounts and hospital wards fill.
The message can't be in contrast to the data, right? It can't be in contrast to the data, right? So, no wonder so many people are going to be dying from this, right?
The press buries flu reports in the back pages to preserve wartime morale. After all, panicked citizens don't show up for work at the shipyard. They don't visit their neighborhood Marine recruiter or buy Liberty loans to fund the war effort.
Okay, so people are doing this without, because they're not saying that there is any kind of legislation about, okay, you can't go to these places, you can't travel, you do all that. They're just not doing it because they believe it makes sense, right? You're sick or whatever, don't go to these places, and now it's having an effect on the war. Like people are, buying bonds, which is basically a loan to your government for the military. So giving financial aid to the war effort. When you have that of course is going to hit productivity for the military.
And that last one is important because Philadelphia is about to throw the largest Liberty loan drive in the country. Soon, thousands will march through the city and hundreds of thousands will turn up to watch and chip in. Doctors urge the mayor to cancel all public gatherings. He refuses. September 27th. There's been progress. Welch and his team at Camp Devins telephone their report to Gorgas. They've found Pfeiffersbacillus in a majority of the flu cases. Park and Williams confirm the findings in their samples. Now, if they can isolate and grow a sample of Pfeiffer's, they can begin work on a vaccine. But
some of this seems contemporary, right, with what's going now. All these events and decisions. It's so fascinating to see this back in 1918 and 1920 of how many of the decisions are similar to what happens, what's kind of happening today, and things of seeing these decisions and how just the decision making, not even necessarily the virus itself or anything like that, but the decision process that's being made. You see a lot of the same decisions about social distancing and closing public gatherings and those sort of things, and you see how they're handling it and stuff like that. So just from the decision making process, not necessarily the actual diseases or the ailments, but the decision process, I think is what I think's most accurately attainable as something we're educating ourselves on from the 1918 is the decisions, right? The responses, more than trying to find commonalities amongst the ailments themselves, because that can be very different.
But Avery isn't so sure. He'd found Pfeiffer's, but not consistently. In fact, he wonders if something else is responsible.
Oh, man.
A virus too small to see. If so, they could only hope that when they produced the vaccine, the horse would make antibodies for this virus as well. It was the best they could do. After making his report, Welch boards a train to D.C. It had been a period of exhausting, dangerous work.
All over the country.
He feels bone-tired and has a headache. The symptoms start to show on the train ride.
He's got it.
He switches his ticket and gets a room at his favorite hotel in Atlantic City. He'll remain there, delirious in self-imposed quarantine for weeks. The most respected man in American medicine is out of action, right when the country needs him most, because America was about to run out of coffins.
Shoot. Snap. Wait, where'd the coffins go?
America was about to run out of coffins.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, these medical people that are getting basically their hands dirty into these locations for the pandemics, they put themselves at such great risk for doing that, to expose themselves, and it's hard because you have to have educated people in those metaphorical trenches, right, that can do the research, and it's so brave of them to do that while risking their own health, like it seems like he is now. And that's hard if you have someone as brilliant, as effective as this guy, and then have to take him out and well, he's doing self-quarantining because I haven't heard of they don't have any kind of law about, okay, you are infected or you've been exposed, therefore you need to be quarantined. That he's doing it himself because he's obviously aware of how that can work. So yeah, that's gonna make things obviously very difficult. Is once those that you need the most are the ones that now can't help. That's gonna be difficult. But like I was saying about a minute or so ago, what's been most interesting about this so far is just seeing responses to the things. And again, not necessarily comparing the viruses themselves, because every virus is different, everything is different. But what is the policy like? What's the policy making like? What are the reactions by the government, the media, the government, the media, and the general public, and local lawmakers, and all that stuff. And you see parallels and stuff of kind of how that works, and the challenges, right, that we're having. I think the best way to put it, that I just keep coming back to my mind, is most of these decisions are lose-lose situations, and trying to find the least bad of the potential bad decisions, which can be very hard, especially if you're employed in a way, like if you're in the military, obviously your priority is the military. If you're in medicine and working for public health, you're obviously going to be more concerned about public health. If you're working in any kind of economic institution, your priority is going to be that. And then who or how do you mediate between all these different concerns and all these different things of the health of, again, the general public, the military, and the economy? How do you navigate all those different concerns into the best decision possible, or the least bad decision possible? That's such a hard thing to do, and you can see how that's very hard to do in the modern issues that we're having. And a lot of those things, they don't change. They're always going to be concerns. They always will be. And again, just hard to make a good decision out of that. I don't envy those policymakers, and then having to sleep at night. And you can see if you make the wrong decision, the guy in the military that ended up taking his own life because of what ended up happening. It sounds like the grief of what happened to those troops by not heeding to the medical advice. But again, he had a job and he had something that he had to be focused on, and it's hard. That's definitely hard. But man, this has been so informative. I think it's perfect timing that we're checking this out. And hopefully you're checking this out, even if it's right now as I'm airing these in, what's today, May 1st, May 2nd of 2020, or you're watching it much later, which is just as useful. That, you know, we learn from these things and just get perspective of anything else, right? And don't necessarily think that everything has to be replicated or when it comes to things, because every scenario is different at different times and how their reactions are, but the decisions, you know, are similar that often have to be made. All right, with that, I think we're good to go here. This was episode 3, so keep a lookout for episode 4. Best thing to do is become a sub and enable those notifications so you know right when videos come out. Also do a lot of live premieres, events, live streams, game streams, all kinds of live things, and have a fun community. If you'd like to know when those are and be connected to that, make sure you enable those notifications. All right, link to the original video is down below. Give that a click so you can give them view, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Very helpful. Thanks for liking the video, their video and my video. Really helps a lot to get exposure and stuff like that. And great. Links to some other stuff down in the description, to the Discord, Patreon, those sort of things. If you want to get involved in the community, is more. A lot of ways you can do that. Thank you for being here and being a part of history education just by watching videos. Spread what you know, get other people on board, and let's make YouTube the best possible place on this planet for history education. All right, with that, we'll see you guys next time. Bye.